Okay. Uh, Welcome to the second lecture of the course OAD. In this session, we are going to have a look at what is the unified process, right? My main reason of touching upon the unified process is that because this is the process that actually came in for the object-oriented systems, right? And this we're going to look at this process in the first half of the lecture for the first 1 hour, and in the second hour we're going to take a look at the first model, the first UML diagram, which is the use case diagram, and we will pick up the case study and draw the diagrams for that. Right, so there's a chat. Your voice is very low. Maybe you can consider increasing the volume at your side. From my side, the volume is the handout is available on the website. Yes. Okay, we'll take the questions as we move ahead, right? But let us start with the unified process. Is the volume still low? It is the maximum. I used the shortcut that you have sent me. It is maximum. Thank you. Okay. Before starting the unified process, uh, for those who have actually gone through the module 1, you would have found a discussion of various other process models. So there would be a discussion on the waterfall model and various variations of the agile as well, right? So for hello, hello. Okay, so you can go through those process models as a prerequisite to this particular course, while in this course, the major focus will be on the unified process, right? So let's start with the unified process. Before I start with the unified process, I'll give you a history of how object-oriented domain started, right? So it was in early 80s that various researchers were working on uh, some kind of an object idea, right? So it was still in a maturity, it was still in a very starting phase, right? So these three researchers, Ivar Jacobson, Booch, and Romberg, right? These three researchers, and they were doing their own research in their own area. So they were not together, they were doing it separately, and each of them proposed their own idea. So Jacobson advocated the idea of OOAD, of object-oriented software engineering, and published a few papers. Booch was coming up with the idea of OOAD, which is called the Booch method. And Romberg, he was working over the idea of object modeling techniques. And this was scattered research that was going on at different places. Then finally, it was in 1997 when these three researchers joined hands and decided to take ahead the object orientation concept as one group, right? So it is very necessary that, I mean, they also found it very necessary that instead of having scattered research over the same kind of aspect, we should join hands and then move ahead. And this was the time when object management group was formed by these three researchers, and they came up with the concept of object-oriented analysis and design, right? So this was the object orientation ideology that was proposed by them. During 1997. right? And this was the time when whenever you propose a new ideology, it is always recommended that you come up with an associated software development process as well, right? So new ideology demands a new software development process, and that is the reason they came up with the unified process. Okay, I'll just change the color. So that unified process, or UML, this was the time, or the UP. So this was the time that they proposed the unified process, right? And one very important aspect of the unified process was UML, or the Unified Modeling Language, right? So it was to support the object-oriented domain that they came up with the unified process, which advocates the use of unified modeling language. We'll see today also, what is unified modeling language as well. Right? So let's move ahead. Unified process has emerged as a very effective software development process for the object-oriented domain, and it is also called as rational unified process, right? Why rational? Because it was one of the researcher was initially working with the IBM, with the Rational company, and the other two also joined him. So they released this unified process under the banner of the concerned company, and that is why it is also known as Rational Unified Process, right? And it advocates the use of unified modeling language. Let's see what this process is. Right? So in this process, it says that development is organized into a series of short, fixed length mini projects called iterations. Right? So iteration is a concept which you must be familiar with, at least those who have a background of software engineering, is that you divide the project requirements into small subsets, which you called as mini projects, and you implement them during a fixed duration, and that fixed duration is called an iteration. The outcome of each iteration is a tested, integrated, and executable partial system, right? So outcome is an integrated executable system, but it is partial, it is not ready for deployment. Each iteration includes workflow or discipline activities like requirements, analysis, design, and implementation, right? So these basic framework activities that were the terminology framework activity is what exists in the models like waterfall, etc., right? Here they do not use the same terminology of the framework activity, but they introduce their own terminology which they called as workflow or discipline activities, and they categorize them as requirement, analysis, design, implementation, and so on, right? And of course, you need multiple iterations to are executed to develop the system, right? So each iteration is a subset of requirements of the complete project, has a fixed duration, and it is in each iteration various workflow activities are executed, right? It will become more clear the moment I'll show you the diagram, right? But I'll just give you a brief description about this first, right? Now this model is iterative as well as incremental, right? So this we understand because we are iterating over and over again, right? And every iteration grows the system incrementally over time, right? So the result of every iteration is a partial system which is executable, but it even keeps on growing, right? So it is incrementally going. So that is the reason it is called iterative and incremental, right? It is also called iterative and evolutionary, right? Why it is iterative and evolutionary as well? Because there is continuous feedback and adaptation of that feedback to evolve the specification as well as design of the system, right? So this is the reason it is both iterative, incremental, as well as evolutionary, right? So this has a unique kind of a diagram as well, right? So it is defined into 3 dimensions. The unified process is impacted by 3 dimensions, and that is the reason it appears what it is, right? So it is iterative, incremental, evolutionary, and so on, right? The iterations are time boxed, so they are fixed length. It is 2 to 6 weeks, right? Uh, Before coming to a detailed description of the 4 phases of this particular model, I will show you first the diagram, right? So this is how the diagrammatic representation of the rational unified process looks like, right? So now let us try and understand what this particular process model tries to explain. So there are phases. It has a total of 4 phases, right? Inception, elaboration, construction, as well as transition, right? Each phase is divided into iterations, right? So you can see in the inception phase, there is only 1 iteration. If you see in the elaboration phase, there are 2 iterations, right? In the construction phase, there are 3 iterations. In the transition phase, there are 4 iterations, right? So your construction phase is the phase which has the largest number of iterations, while your inception phase is the one which has least number of iterations, right? I just go back to my previous slide and give you an overview of what each phase is about, right? So your first phase is the inception phase. This is somewhat equivalent to the feasibility study phase, right? It is not the requirement phase, rather than it is a feasibility study phase where the aim is to develop an approximate vision, identify the business scope, right, and provide a vague estimates, right? Do not try to map the phases of the rational unified process, RUP, to the framework activities or the phases of the waterfall model, right? Because there is an overlap, right? So there is no direct mapping that you can do between these phases and the phases of the waterfall model or the framework activities. There is an amalgamation that they propose in this research paper, which is in a way trying to address all the same things, right? But always with a different angle, with a more sophisticated angle, which they say is more inclined towards and good for object-oriented systems, right? So inception phase is not only feasibility study, but it goes slightly ahead of that and does a bit of analysis as well, right? So there is no demarcation that it does only feasibility study, but it does a bit of analysis as well, right? Coming to the elaboration phase. Now the elaboration phase is not only requirements, but also a bit of designing, right? So a majority of requirements is done in the elaboration phase, but even a majority of designing is also done, right? So don't try to map these phases with the SDLC phases, but the reason I'm trying to map and explain it to you, so that is only for the explanation's sake, so that you understand what is the relation, right? But there is no demarcation between the two, right? So inception is a little bit of feasibility and a little bit of designing analysis as well. Elaboration is more of requirements, little bit of analysis, and then goes into the design, right? And then there is construction, and then finally there is transition, right? The testing seems to be missing, right? Why? Because it puts in testing inside the construction itself, right? So it does not advocate that there has to be a separate testing phase. Testing is a part of the construction itself. And then transition has a bit of testing at the user end, right? So whatever testing is supposed to be done at the developer's end is kind of amalgamated in the construction phase, whereas the testing which is required at the user end is put into the transition phase. So it says transition phase is beta tests including deployment, right? I'll go back to the diagram again and explain and answer your few of the queries also, right? So if you see, just give me a second, I'll just remove these annotations and try something new. If I can draw a box, anyways. Okay, so your inception phase is this, only consisting of one iteration. Your elaboration phase, first iteration is this and second iteration is this, right? Now if you see this side, these are the workflow activities which are being executed, right? Now in the inception phase, if you see this coloring, there is more of business modeling. So you see a peak of business modeling, and this peak goes on reducing as you move ahead the phases, right? So the idea is, let me put it this way. Okay, so there are discipline as well as phases. Your disciplines are on the left hand side, right? So these are my disciplines on the left hand side, and these are my phases, right? Now I'll give you a relationship between the discipline and the phases. Now what's happening? During one iteration, work goes on in most or all of the disciplines, right? So we'll go back and see. So in every phase, if you see, or in one phase, work goes on in each and every discipline, right? It is only the amount of work that is different. So if you see in this construction phase, there is still a little bit of business modeling, still a little bit of requirements, still a little bit of analysis and design. In fact, more of analysis and design, but too much of construction, right? So if it is the construction phase, it has its major emphasis on implementation, on construction and testing. However, there is work going on in the other phases as well, right? So your every iteration has its own small set of requirements, for which you will capture the requirements for that phase, do an analysis of those, do a design of those, but eventually when you're in the construction phase, that new set of requirements is quite small, right? So that is the reason your emphasis on business modeling and requirements is reducing. You are your product has reached such a high level of maturity that while your product is more or less in a construction phase, but there are only very small portions of the requirements which are left to be picked up, to be analyzed, designed and implemented, right? I hope this clears what I'm trying to say. Let me just clear the annotation. I will still continue to explain this. So we go back to the relationship between disciplines and phases. So during one iteration, work goes on in almost all or every discipline. However, related effort across discipline changes over time and over phases, right? So the amount of effort that you are putting in the implementation and testing discipline is less in inception, increases in elaboration, becomes too high in construction, and goes down in transition, right? Similarly, if you see the other discipline activity, say for example deployment, in inception there is hardly any work that is being carried out in the deployment activity, whereas in elaboration you start with some level of deployment activity. When you're in the construction phase, in the initial iterations of the construction phase, there is very less work that is being done in the deployment discipline, whereas it increases when you approach the latter iterations of the construction phase, right? And then it takes a peak when you are in the transition phase. So in the first iteration of the transition phase, you have its peak, and then it goes down to a zero again, right? So every work discipline is executed in every phase, but the amount of time you spend in every work discipline varies from phase to phase, right? Okay, let's try and again move ahead. So early iterations apply greater relative emphasis to the requirement and design. This we saw earlier. So the initial phases have more emphasis in requirements and design, right? So they have their peak, business modeling, requirements, analysis and design. They have their peak in the early iterations, right? Whereas the latter discipline activities, they have their peak in the latter iterations, right? Okay. In the latter ones, as the requirement and core design stabilizes through a process of feedback and adaptation. So there is little emphasis that you put on the requirement and designing work activities in the latter iterations, right? Okay. Apart from the workflow activities, right? So these were our workflow discipline activities. There are a few more discipline activities that we see here, right? These are the configuration and change management, project management, and setting up the environment, right? So those who have already studied software engineering, you would be able to relate these particular activities to the umbrella activities, right? So in case you have not read software engineering before, just pick up the book for software engineering, which is R.S. Pressman, right? And I think second chapter of R.S. Pressman, which deals with the software process models, right? So it is a good idea to just read that book as a I would say as a story book, and just see try and make a analogy what you receive from there and how this particular rational unified process is close to that particular process, right? But for those who've already studied, you will find that these are the activities which are equivalent to the umbrella activities which are being specified in the framework activities, right? So these umbrella activities are the activities which are executed throughout the project life cycle, right? So configuration management, change management, project management, setting up the environment. So these certain umbrella activities are the ones which are to be executed throughout the project life cycle. So whether you are in the requirement phase or the construction phase, configuration management is something that is essential to be executed, right? So this I have in the next slide. So apart from the typical workflow activities, there are also activities like configuration and change management, project management, and environment setup, which are executed during the various phases of the unified process, right? So now if you see this diagram again, it has three dimensions, right? So there are phases, there are workflow activities, plus there are iterations to it, right? So every phase is divided into iterations, right? Okay. Now, before moving ahead, I would take up a few questions. So this chat is moving quite fast. Okay. One question says that the implementation peak is in the construction phase. Yes, definitely that's right, because implementation is what is happening in the construction phase, right? So construction phase is what has the major focus on the implementation of the project, right? It says environment setup is required throughout the project. Won't it be only during initial phase? So it's an environment setup. So there might be certain requirements. So as you get the new set of requirements, there might be certain level of environment support that might be required to be added as you move ahead the phases, right? So which might not be initially there, but of course, the major setting up of the environment would be done at the start of every phase, right? So if you see this diagram more carefully, you would find that in the environment uh, discipline activity, the environment discipline activity has its peak every time a new phase starts, right? You see this here, here, as well as in the transition phase. So whatever preparation in terms of environment is required to support a particular phase, all those activities are carried out in the first iteration of that particular phase, and hence the peak for the environment activity. I would take up a few more questions. What is iteration? Can you please again explain again? So every phase is divided into a set of iterations, right? So a phase might be longer in time, right? So you divide it into fixed time slots, say around 2 weeks or 2 to 4 weeks, and say that this set of requirements is what we are going to implement in these 2 to 4 weeks, right? You put a deadline. So suppose it's 4 week. My first iteration is 4 week. So in the first 4 week, I will implement this particular set of requirements, and then in the next iteration, you will take up the next set of requirements, right? So in this way, every end of the iteration, you have a small partial executable system, right? Okay, so there's one question. It says that in elaboration, a bit of deployment is going on, right? How is that possible, right? So when we say that the result of every iteration is a partially executable software, right? And that partial executable software also needs to be, say, reached out to the customer for feedback, right? So there is continuous feedback, as we discussed before also. So when you need to reach out to the customer, so in order to be able to display that partial product to the customer, right, you would need a minimum level of deployment, right? So that might be a dummy deployment with the some ends actually not implemented, right, hard coded, but you need some way of representing the system to the to the client, right? So there's, you would find that in somewhere late in the elaboration, there is some amount of deployment that has started. How is it different from waterfall model? It's totally different from waterfall model. I will not elaborate on the waterfall model as of now. You are requested to go through the lecture slides and the software engineering RS Pressman chapter on the software process models. But yes, waterfall model is a straight model which executes every framework activity in a linear fashion. There is no going back, there is no feedback, right? So waterfall model was the first kind of a model which came in. Maybe because it was the first one, so we will not say it is the wrong model, right? But it had so many drawbacks that uh, more suitable models were required to develop more recent kind of systems. Okay, are there any more questions? Some of the questions I don't understand. Uh, okay, I will explain what is the difference between rational, unified, and agile. Definitely, that is there in the slides coming ahead. Okay, one question it says why business modeling and requirements cannot be clubbed. There is, see, the idea is you are doing the business analysis as well as a bit of requirements and the same time initially in the inception phase in order to get an idea as to what is expected by the customer. Is that good enough to be actually implemented also or not, right? So it's kind of a feasibility study, right? But the feasibility study is not limited to only the business modeling, but trying to capture more of requirements as well so that you have a better picture of uh, what the business wants and what you can actually provide for using your software, right? So if you see joining or doing the business modeling and requirements in the initial phases makes the things more clear, right? So if I just do the business modeling for 6 weeks and then I come and find out the requirements from that business model, you've already lost those 6 months, and by the time you find out the requirements, you find that it was infeasible to actually execute what is required, right? So the moment you receive the requirements from the business, try and convert it into a requirement model so that you are able to address the gap between the business and the software as quickly as possible, right? And this is one of the advantages of doing more of business and requirements in the inception itself. Okay, with this, I'll not move on to more questions. I think I've addressed most of them, right? And we can take up more as we move ahead. So this is what we have covered. So these are the typical workflow activities which are executed during the various phases of the rational unified process, right? And this here we discussed what is the relationship between the various disciplines, or we call the workflow activities, and the phases of the rational unified process, right? Uh, okay, now these are the various artifacts that are being produced in the unified process, which would be our focus and point of concern during this particular course, right? So your domain model, which is an outcome of the business modeling, will be the one that we will look at. The requirement model, which specifically produces the use case model, right? And this is the model that we're going to look at today as well. And finally, the design model. So these three important artifacts which are executed during, which are created during the unified various disciplines of the unified process is what we are going to look at. Before I move ahead, there is one small clarification or a small addition that I would like to talk about. There is a word called artifacts and work products, right? I'll put forward this word. What do these two words mean? Work products and artifacts, right? So these work products are the documents which are created during the execution of any activity, right? The work product is not the code that you are writing, but the work product is a process document which is being created during any activity, right? Although these kind of models, the unified process as well as agile, they lay less emphasis on creating work products or artifacts. However, they do have their own notations for creating work products, and they do have their own importance, right? So every activity has an associated work product which has its own importance, right? It is the rigor with which you create these work products is what varies, right? But the work products are actually the process documents, and mind you, they do not have anything to do with the code. They are not the code. They help you in developing the code. They are required to develop the project, to develop the code, but they are something not what you ship finally to the customer, right? They are process documents which are created in order to support the development of the software. They do not directly make themselves to they directly do not become a part of the product that is shipped to the customers, right? User manual is one document which is definitely being shipped to the customer, but it is not a work product, right? Your user manuals do not define the process. The user manuals define how the product has to be used, right? I'll give you a more clarification on what the work products are. So any document, like we'll see, so if I create a use case diagram, if I create a domain model, if I create a class diagram, if I create a sequence diagram, these are all work products, right? They are something that I'm creating in order to help me create the final product, but they do not make themselves to the project, to the final customer, right? I hope this is clear. Somebody says you can't hear me. Have I lost the connection? You can't hear me, or you can hear? Okay, fine. You can hear me. I think it should be okay. Okay, we move ahead and see how is unified process and agile different. Okay. Okay, before that, there is a quick overview that I have here as to what is the main emphasis that is being carried out in various phases, during various phases of the unified process, along with what are the various work products that are being created during each of the phase. Okay, there's one question when it says what is the difference between artifacts and work products. Work products are the ones which are created to help execute the process, right? It does not have anything to do with the code. Whereas artifact, you can consider it as a parent class to the work product. The artifacts even consist of the code, right? So work product is only related with the process, whereas artifact is also including the code and the work product. So artifact is any document that is created. So be it a Java class or be it a UML diagram, right? So we refer those as with the word artifacts, whereas work products are precisely referred to the documents which are created during the process, which do not make themselves to the customer finally. Okay, there's a question. I don't know why this question is coming. What is RUP? Rational Unified Process. RUP is Rational Unified Process. Both are same. Rational Unified Process and Unified Process both are same. It was because it was under the name of the company, or the people who actually proposed the unified process were working with IBM Rational, so they kind of gave it a brand name as Rational Unified Process. Okay, so quickly I will go through these 5-6 slides as to what happens in every phase. In the inception phase, you establish a vision of the project, right? You develop a business case of the project. At very minimum, tentative architecture is decided, right? So if you decide the architecture and you do a bit of business analysis as well as requirement analysis, then at the inception phase itself, the risks are identified and prioritized, right? So at this phase itself, you do a bit of risk analysis because you have an idea of the requirement model and a tentative architecture, and you estimate the risks, right? Apart from this, projects, the estimation of the project is done, as well as the preparation for the elaboration phase is started, right? So this is what is done in the inception phase. And coming to the work products that are created in the inception phase, so this is the complete list of the work products which are created in the inception phase. There's a vision document, the initial use case model, a project glossary, right? So if you would go through your book, you would find a detailed project glossary template as well, right? Then there is initial business case, assessment of the risk, project plan, business model, as well as one or more prototype, if required, is created, right? And in this particular course, this is what we're going to look at. Only the use case model from the inception phase, right? So this will be our focus in this particular course as well as in the remaining half of this particular lecture, right? I'll move ahead. So in the elaboration phase, the use cases are specified, right? So there is use case modeling which is done in the elaboration phase as well. Around 10% of the use cases are identified and elaborated in the initial inception phase, and rest you take up in the elaboration phase. And these are the various important models which are created in this particular elaboration phase. So if you will see, this is the whole phase which we are going to stick to in this particular course, right? So your use case model, analysis model, design model, and so on, right? So we're going to have a complete course which focuses on the elaboration phase itself, right? There will be effectively no emphasis on construction and deployment, right? So you just need to know what happens in these phases, but the course will not deal into elaboration on implementation and the deployment model. Okay, I move ahead. Coming to the work products that are implemented or created, not implemented, sorry, created in the elaboration phase. So you have use case model, analysis model, architecture of the system, preliminary design model, and so on, right? Okay, as we move ahead, okay, there's a request for a break. We'll take that. I'll have just 2-3 more slides. We'll take a break after that. So in the construction phase, it is mostly adding skeleton to the software, right, which is effectively an important phase, and then you finally transit to the next phase, right? And these are some of the work products which are created in the construction phase. So there is some level of designing also which is done in this phase, and then of course software components are developed, and then there is a test plan, test cases are there, and then user manual, instructions manual, etc., etc., right? Although this phase will not be our point of concern in this particular course, right? And then finally the transition phase. Okay. I think we can take a 5-minute break here. I'll pause the modeling recording, and we'll be back after 5 minutes. So let's be back at 4:57.